I still remember that night in Las Vegas when Lucent AI threw its grand end of year gala at the Grand Lux Hotel, the same place chosen as the stage for next year's internal IPO launch. The jazz band played live, golden lights spilling across glittering gowns and champagne glasses that never stayed empty. Everyone looked radiant, buzzing with pride and excitement. Everyone except me. I was alone in a small wooden cabin on the edge of the Arizona desert. There wasn't enough signal to receive text, only just enough to check emails in the morning. That day, like every day of my long awaited break, I woke early, brewed a pot of Guatemalan coffee I'd brought from home, poured it into my chipped white mug, and sat on the porch watching the sunrise. It was the third day of the first real vacation I'd taken in 14 years. Just as I took my first sip, my phone buzzed. No ringtone, no alert, just a subject line sliding across the lock screen that read, "Important notice regarding your position." I'd seen enough of those to know they usually meant procedural updates or internal announcements. But for some reason, my hand went cold. I set the mug down, unlocked the phone, and read. Only a few lines, but they cut like ice. We regret to inform you that your role has been eliminated in the end of year restructuring. The decision takes effect immediately. There will be no severance payout due to adjustments in personnel costs. We hope you continue to enjoy your vacation. I don't know what made me laugh. A dry, short, hollow laugh that escaped before I could stop it. Maybe it was the absurdity of it all. Or maybe I'd been expecting this longer than I wanted to admit. The desert wind moved softly through the trees while I sat there. No shock, no anger, just silence. I didn't call anyone. I didn't reply. I didn't scream. I just opened the folder labeled Contracts, Legal Attachments, scrolled down to the section I'd named 12.4b. The trigger, and opened the PDF I'd quietly edited nearly a year ago. That clause had been written with the calm precision of someone who'd been pushed past the edge, someone who'd spent 70 plus hours a week inside a system that rewarded silence more than loyalty. I forwarded the termination email, along with the contract, to my attorney, Jack Levine, a former military prosecutor who now handles wrongful termination cases for executives. No message, no explanation, just one word in the subject line: activate. Then I set the phone face down and poured another cup of coffee, not to forget, but to savor the moment. No one in Las Vegas knew that while they were toasting to their leaner, more agile, cost optimized workforce, they'd just triggered a $12 million clause they themselves had signed. None of them imagined that the woman missing from the party was the same one who had planted that little mine nearly a year earlier. I remember the conversation with the CFO clearly. They had begged me to take over the Argonne Legacy Division, a tangled, aging project no one wanted to touch. I agreed, but not without conditions. I told them that if they wanted me to clean up their mess, I wanted a protective clause in my contract, and they signed it, without reading, without objection. My coffee went cold. I pulled a blanket over my shoulders and watched the desert sun rise above the low ridges. I didn't feel anger or loss. I felt precision, a cold, perfect rightness. They thought I was a supporting role, someone disposable. What they never understood was that I didn't just plan my projects, I planned for their betrayal. When I opened my laptop, it wasn't working. It was to wait. 5 days, that was the window they had to undo their mistake before clause. 12.4b executed automatically. I sipped the cold coffee. Outside, a red-beaked bird landed on the railing. Inside me was stillness, but beneath that stillness, a quiet detonation was waiting for its cue. I stayed there, in the frozen silence between desert and betrayal. No alarms, no flashing lights, just an email that had already set everything in motion. And in that silence, I thought of you, the one listening now. Maybe you're hearing this while driving home after a long day, or lying on your couch, one earbud half slipped from your pillow. Maybe you've sat in an office somewhere, biting your tongue as you realize they saw you as nothing more than a line item on a spreadsheet. If that's true, then you understand me more than you think. Tell me where you're listening from. I'd really like to know, because sometimes a story only finds its meaning when it reaches the right person. And if you too love stories about quiet precision, about plans planted in silence but blooming right on time, then hit subscribe. This story is only just beginning. I'm not someone who acts on impulse. Every move I've ever made, even the ones that look like retreats, was calculated long before it happened. Clause 12.4b wasn't born out of hurt or anger. It was the result of months spent observing, remembering, and mastering the art of strategic silence. I started drafting it late one night, about 8 months ago, while sitting alone in the conference room on the 27th floor after an unnamed briefing. They had called me in to negotiate the handover of the Argonne Legacy Division, a dying technical group, outdated in both system and mindset. Everyone avoided it like a cursed relic, but I understood why they came to me. I was the only one who never refused the dirty work. They thought I would do what I'd always done: quietly shoulder the load, fix their mess, then step aside without a word. But this time, I wasn't that person anymore. I no longer wanted to be the name tucked in some database labeled dependable. I needed something to protect myself from a system that treated dedication as routine and loyalty as disposable. So I rewrote my contract by hand, from the performance clauses to the incentive terms, and finally added one small, unassuming line buried between two familiar finance sections. Clause 12.4b. It read, terminating an employee during an approved vacation period without a clear, documented, and acknowledged reason shall constitute a breach of lawful protection status. Such a breach shall trigger an automatic compensation mechanism, including reinstatement of all revoked benefits, full payout of vested shares, remaining salary, and a fixed penalty of 12 million United States dollars. Payment deadline: 5 business days from the date of breach detection. It sounded insane, I know. But that insanity was the perfect disguise. Who would ever believe that an employee would be calm enough and careful enough to prepare for the worst case scenario like this? Who would think a single line could sink a company preparing to go public? I sent the contract to the legal department. The head of legal was on sick leave that week, so a law intern, probably a final year student, skimmed through it, stamped it, and signed off. I still remember his tired but relieved face, happy to finish another task. Then came the signature from the CFO, Craig Harmon. He was rushing to the airport for a conference when he asked, "This is the Argonne reassignment document, right?" I nodded. "Fine. Go ahead," he said, signing quickly. A careless signature, but genuine. And that was all I needed. I never mentioned the clause again. Not once. It existed only as 3 backups: one in my personal email, one on an external drive, and one printed copy locked away in my desk drawer. I worked, led the Argonne team through every crisis, every setback. They didn't know I was walking a tightrope, but I did. I'd come close to using it a few times when they delayed project approvals or slashed the team's budget mid-quarter. But I didn't. I couldn't. Because if that clause surfaced too early, it would lose its power. I had to wait for the right moment. And just as I'd predicted, they triggered it themselves without me saying a single word. I thought I'd feel joy when it happened, but I didn't. What I felt was something colder, a stillness so deep it almost frightened me. Like a soldier who stays awake through the night, only to realize at dawn that the enemy had already stepped on the mine long before he opened his eyes. I know that within the next few hours, Lucent AI's internal legal team will find it. Someone, maybe a new hire or a slow QA analyst, will spot the line, highlight it, and forward it up the chain. Then there will be calls, emails, a closed-door meeting. But no matter what they do, no matter how they scramble, one thing won't change. They signed it. And I'm no longer inside their system. I'm the outsider now, the only one who knows the game started long before they realized they were players. My silence is my weapon. And Clause 12.4b, that's the trap they walked into with their own 2 feet. I knew their internal schedule by heart. I used to help design it for years. The final executive conference before the holidays always took place 3 days after the company party. A closed meeting. No media, no junior staff. Only senior leadership and a few Lucent AI attorneys sitting around a long walnut table in the soundproof room on the 42nd floor where even a sigh couldn't escape. While I sat outside my cabin, feet propped on the railing, a glass of whiskey in hand, I could picture exactly what was happening in that room. I didn't need to be there to know who sat where. Craig Harmon, the CFO, would be at the head of the left side of the table, where he always placed his iPad and black leather notebook. Across from him would be Denise Valera, the chief legal officer, her thin framed glasses resting perfectly, expression unchanged. To the right, Karen, the head of HR, is the one who sent my termination email without the decency of a phone call. I knew the meeting would begin with the Q4 financial summary, followed by a presentation titled Workforce Optimization and Organizational Efficiency, another way of saying mass layoffs. Craig would lead that section, calm as ever, quoting the metrics he liked to call strategic resource realignment. I'd heard those words too many times: neat, bloodless, and sharper than any blade. But this time, they wouldn't just be discussing me as a cost line. Sooner or later, someone from the legal team would speak up. Maybe Alex, the new legal associate hired last month. He'd be the one to notice Clause 12.4b while reviewing the termination files before presenting them to the board. And when he opened his mouth, the air in that room would shift. I could see it. Alex, voice unsteady, hands trembling slightly. I think we have an issue with Sarah Tran's file. Craig probably wouldn't understand right away. He'd wave it off, smirk, and say, "It's fine, already handled." But then Alex would mention it, the clause, 12.4b. His voice nervous, but clear. That's when the silence would hit. Denise would open the file, check the signature, and trace the activation date. I knew her well. She never showed emotion, but this time she'd clench her jaw just enough for her cheek to twitch, because she'd realized the clause wasn't a bluff. It was a buried mine, legal, signed, and already detonated. Karen would be the first to protest. That can't be right. It must have been left over from an old contract template. A weak defense. But Denise would shake her head, pointing to the timestamp and live signature. It was added later, 8 months ago, and signed by Craig himself. I could almost see Craig's face drain of color. He'd grab the printed file, flipping through pages until his eyes stopped on his own signature, right under the clause he never bothered to read. I'd seen him do that before, at least 10 times, signing quickly to save time. But this time, that habit would light the fuse. The room would fall silent, not because they didn't understand what was happening, but because they all understood too well what came next. $12 million wasn't an easy number to swallow, especially after they'd just redirected the severance fund into executive retention bonuses. If word of this got out, everything would collapse: the investors' confidence, the company's reputation before IPO, and the careers of everyone sitting at that table. I took a sip of whiskey and exhaled. It wasn't satisfaction I felt, not triumph either, just certainty. I didn't need to send another email, didn't need to call my lawyer. Everything was already in motion, a trigger set long ago. And if I guessed right, they were scrambling to contain it, hoping I didn't know. But they were wrong. I knew. I'd known before they even hit send. I set my glass on the railing and stretched. Over the Arizona sky, the evening light poured gold across the distant ridges. I thought of Denise, likely searching for a way to negotiate, and Craig, sweating under his tailored shirt. Maybe Karen was reaching for her phone to call me, but I wouldn't answer. I'd stepped out of their game long ago. Now they would have to play it without me. The next morning, I woke not to an alarm, but to the tapping sound of a woodpecker against the old oak tree outside the cabin. The mountain air was cold and razor sharp, clear like the pause before a storm truly begins. I stretched, brewed a fresh pot of coffee, and set my phone face down on the wooden table as I always did. Still no reason to touch it. But after my first sip, the phone began to vibrate. Once, then twice, then a long series of tremors, until even the table shook. I didn't answer. I just tilted my head, watching familiar names light up the screen one after another. Karen from HR, Denise Valera, Craig Harmon, all calling before sunrise. an unmistakable sign that the earthquake had officially begun. I let it buzz until the calls turned into messages. The first was from Karen. Can we have a quick call this morning? Just a small issue with the paperwork. Right after came one from Craig. Sarah, I think there's been a small misunderstanding. Can we talk? Then Denise. I need to confirm a few clauses in the Argonne restructuring contract. Call me as soon as possible. I smiled faintly. A few clauses. The way people choose their words when they're losing control is always fascinating. I picked up the phone, but not to call. I opened my inbox instead. 3 urgent emails waited, one from Denise. Subject line, urgent. Verification of Clause 12.4b. One from the Internal Legal Department, requesting early dialogue regarding your compensation rights. And the last from an address outside the company system. Jack Levine, my attorney. Subject, they read it. The message was one line. Received a copy of the internal memo at 3:02 a.m. Status, panic. I exhaled slowly, taking another sip. This was the part where they began to understand the cost of carelessness, and what they were hoping for now was my mercy. The phone rang again. An unfamiliar number. I knew the type, probably a legal assistant or an intermediary sent to renegotiate. I answered, saying nothing. Waiting. Sarah? This is Alex from Legal. I know we haven't spoken before, but I just need a few minutes. I stayed silent. We just want to make sure that, well, there isn't any misunderstanding about Clause 12.4b. We believe it may have been a non-intentional editorial error, and if that's the case, the company would be happy to discuss a good faith revision. Editorial error? I nearly laughed. A 300-word clause with full figures, legal language, deadlines, and penalties, and they called it an editorial error? I have nothing more to add, I said. Everything you need is in the document you're holding. I understand. But Sarah, one meeting. We can still find a solution before this goes too far. Nothing is going too far, I interrupted. Everything is happening right on schedule. I hung up. Not angry, not cold, just certain, exactly as I'd planned. Within the next hour, 2 more calls came from other company attorneys. One polite, soft-voiced, offering an informal settlement. The other firmer, trying to sound authoritative. You should consider that taking this to court might damage your professional reputation. I laughed, not out of spite, but because of how predictable fear always sounds when wrapped in diplomacy. My answer didn't change. The clause was signed. I'm only exercising my rights. There was nothing more they could say. And once they realized negotiation wouldn't work, I knew they'd move to the next stage, containment. I pictured them huddled in a closed meeting, discussing risk control, searching for a way out before the board discovered what had happened. But what they didn't understand was that I didn't need to lift another finger. Everything was already lined up like dominoes. Once the first fell, the rest was just a matter of time. At 11:17 sharp, Jack sent me his second email of the day. Subject, status, official. The message read simply, Notice of breach and payment demand submitted. Countdown begins. That was all I needed. I closed my laptop, stood up, and stepped onto the porch. The cold air bit at my skin, but it carried the calm weight of control. I hadn't sought revenge. I was claiming fairness, on their own terms, under their own signatures. The sky turned pale gray, hinting at a coming drizzle. I took a deep breath. They thought they could erase me like a number in a spreadsheet. What they never calculated was that I had learned their language and written a story they could never delete. I didn't need to do anything else. No expose posts, no calls to the press, no messages to old colleagues. The collapse had already begun from within. According to Jack's message, or more precisely, from his inside contact within the company's legal division, an emergency meeting had been called that very morning at Elvara headquarters, 12th floor, the executive lockdown floor for crisis strategy. Closed doors. No cameras, no assistants, no recordings. Yet information still leaked, and this time it leaked faster than they could draft an internal communication plan. Jack's assistant, a sharp young woman named Ivy, had memorized nearly the entire sequence of the meeting with the precision of a stenographer. She sent him a PDF summary titled Snake in the Den. The contents were almost exactly as I'd predicted. Denise, the chief legal officer, was the first to confirm that Clause 12.4b not only existed but had been fully executed, complete with signatures, digital seals, timestamp verification, and even internal security hashes from the company's contract management system. It wasn't a draft, it was a legally binding document, ready for court. The problem was, no one remembered reading it. Craig, the chief operating officer, the man who signed my vacation approval, was the first to freeze when he saw his name listed among the signatories. I thought this was the retention support package, he stammered. I didn't realize it contained a penalty clause. Didn't realize. They never did. And that was exactly what I counted on. Denise, to her credit, stayed composed. She understood the danger. She had once mocked me during an all-hands meeting for being as rigid as an Excel sheet, but she was still a seasoned lawyer, which meant she knew what came next: protect the organization and quietly position someone else to take the fall. She asked the question that would start the fire. Why did HR approve a termination while Sarah was on approved leave? And why did no one in legal review the contract before sending the termination email? Karen, the head of HR, the same one who once called me the temporary pillar of the Argonne team, snapped back instantly. We acted under directives from operations. The termination email was drafted by legal. Then Lucas, the chief financial officer who had championed workforce cost optimization from day one, spoke coldly. We can't react emotionally. Clause 12.4b is a vulnerability. The question is, who allowed it to be signed, and why wasn't it caught in review? No one answered. The room fell into that uneasy silence Jack described as the kind that fills a classroom when someone's been caught cheating, but no one knows who yet. Worse, the contract didn't exist in just one copy. I had sent it through 3 official channels: corporate email, the internal document management system, and a backup in my private cloud drive. It was traceable, unerasable. I knew their game, shared. Blame means diluted accountability. But I also knew Elvara's culture better than anyone. They didn't believe in collective mistakes. They always needed a name, a scapegoat to present before the board, to purge the guilt and keep the system looking clean. And this time, Denise had chosen Karen. Jack told me that during the meeting, Denise had emphasized the HR budget cycle guidelines, signed off by Karen, which required HR to verify contract protection status before terminating any employee on approved leave. They hadn't done it. Karen stood up, shouting across the room, "You're the one who cleared that contract. I just followed the procedure." But Denise only gave a thin smile and flipped to the printed contract, showing my signature, Craig's, Lucas's, and notably, none from Karen. Every eye turned toward her. She sat down, face drained of color. I could picture the panic spreading across the room like an oil stain, each of them realizing they'd walked straight into a trap built from their own carelessness. And while they scrambled to assign blame, I sat on my porch, quietly stacking the old sticky notes filled with ideas no one ever read. The ones they used to laugh at, calling them unrealistic. Maybe they were right, but I never wrote them to impress anyone. I wrote them because I knew that one day, those words, if sharpened enough, would become the coldest scalpel of all. And now, the scalpel had cut. Jack wasn't like any lawyer I'd ever met. No crisp suits, no polished speeches, no pointless checking-in calls. He was the kind of man who walked into your office, quietly set a folder on your desk, looked you straight in the eye and asked, "How much do you want them to lose?" And I knew then I had chosen the right person. We met 3 years ago at a closed seminar called Contract Traps and the Art of Escape. Back then, I was just another attendee. Jack was the keynote speaker, a man who'd won multiple landmark cases against major corporations for wrongful termination, internal discrimination, and unlawful restructuring. But the reason I stayed in touch with him wasn't his resume or his ruthless precision. It was the way he said one short, cold, and brutally honest sentence. The law doesn't protect the weak. It protects those who plan ahead. The moment I forwarded my termination email, Jack handled everything. He didn't need me to vent, didn't need outrage. He only asked for 3 things: my contract, my work record, and any internal documents I'd kept. Fortunately, or rather by design, I had all three. Jack called it the three-layer rule: contract, evidence, and motive. When you have all three, you don't need to shout. You just wait for the right moment and open the right file. After reading the contract and clause 12.4b, Jack stayed silent for a long moment, then said, "Perfect, clean, clear, priceless." I'll never forget the way he laid out each move like a chessboard. First, he sent a copy of the contract and the termination email to Elvara's legal department with a short subject line: activation of the breach clause, counsel of record, Jack M. Levine. One line, but enough to throw their legal division into chaos. The next day, Jack was on a flight to New York, where Elvara's parent company was headquartered. He didn't bring a team, just an old leather briefcase, a stack of color-coded files, and a list of names, from the chief executive officer and chief financial officer to the lead investors and insurance representatives. He understood one thing: if you want them truly worried, don't hit their reputation. Hit their ledger. First, Jack sent a formal notice of contractual breach to Elvara's corporate insurance provider, outlining the violated clause, the penalty value, and the cascading financial risk if left unresolved. It wasn't about demanding money, it was about triggering liability. And Jack knew that once the insurer realized they were covering a potential 8-figure loss, they'd turn their pressure inward. Next, Jack reached out to Elvara's two largest shareholders, both sitting on the board. He sent a concise briefing, complete with verified evidence, but without any demand. The last line read simply, "I believe you'll want to review how the Q3 restructuring was executed." That afternoon, I got a message from Jack. Emergency board meeting. Shareholders unhappy. We're ahead. I didn't ask for details. When Jack said ahead, it meant someone was about to lose a title to save their own skin. By day 3, Jack officially submitted the compensation demand under Clause 12.4b, complete with legal documentation and a 5-business-day deadline. The letter was framed as a pre-litigation settlement request, firm yet diplomatic, not cornering them, but leaving no escape either. That same day, Denise called, the first to break the silence. She wanted to clarify the clause, her tone softer than it had been during the board meeting. Jack replied, "It's already clear. The only thing left to do is pay on time." She hesitated. If we negotiate privately, could that number be reduced?" Jack didn't refuse. He just said, "We're listening." But with every hour that passes without action, the goodwill decreases automatically. A countdown without a clock. That night, I received an email from Jack. Subject: the cards are face up. Inside, only 2 sentences. They've confirmed the contract's validity. Time to close the game. I stared at the laptop screen while the wind brushed against the dried trees outside. I didn't feel joy, not triumph, just a deep, steady calm, as if this was always meant to happen, and now it finally had. It wasn't that I won. It was the moment they stopped reading the fine print. The internal board meeting at Elvara took place on Monday morning, inside a glass-walled conference room on the 34th floor of headquarters. The room was spacious, polished, lined with soundproof walls and a silent air filtration system. But that morning, the air was heavy, thick, like the still pressure before a storm. I wasn't there, of course, but Jack had someone inside. One of Elvara's senior attorneys had studied with him at Yale. They weren't friends, but the man was smart enough to recognize when a mine was about to go off. And this time, he chose to speak before being caught in the blast. It started with a short presentation from the chief financial officer, Gregory Malins, who had approved the restructuring that eliminated what he called non-core positions like mine. He spoke plainly, avoiding my name, referring to me only as the Sarah R. case, brushing past the breach clause as if it were a clerical error. Then Ellen Cortez, a board member representing the company's second-largest investment fund, asked directly, "Is this clause legally binding and enforceable?" The room went silent. Gregory hesitated, his voice wavering. "We're reviewing the validity of Clause 12.4b. It may have been leftover content from an outdated contract template. It might not be enforceable." That's when another voice cut through, Brian Lynn, head of the internal legal department, the same man who had reviewed the contract Jack sent 3 days earlier. His tone was flat, steady. The clause was properly drafted, fully executed, time-stamped, and signed. Legally, it's binding. I could imagine Gregory's face then, bewildered and furious that a subordinate had contradicted him in front of the board. Denise, the HR director, tried to recover, but we never activated that clause. She didn't respond, didn't negotiate. She stayed silent and suddenly brought in counsel. I believe that shows a lack of good faith. Ellen looked up, her voice calm. Lack of good faith, or a decade of too much faith, finally replaced by self-defense. At that point, printed copies of the contract containing Clause 12.4b were handed around the table. And just as Jack predicted, when the board members with financial authority reached the words mandatory compensation of $12 million, their expressions shifted. Another member, Richard, the head of internal audit, asked, "Was this penalty accounted for in the budget?" Gregory faltered, "No, because we didn't believe payment would be necessary." "Then you're mistaken," Richard said flatly. "If the contract is valid, this becomes a legal liability, and it could compromise this quarter's financial report." "We're still preparing for the supplemental IPO, aren't we?" The room erupted in murmurs. I didn't have to be there to feel the tension. People exchanging glances, each realizing that this wasn't just a financial error, but a chain reaction that could shake their entire market. Strategy. Jack received a message mid-meeting. They're splitting into sides. The board's no longer aligned. Someone might be forced to step down. He replied with one word: correct. From there, the executives shifted tactics. One proposal suggested renegotiating the compensation amount, citing corporate restructuring pressures. Brian shook his head. The clause has no financial exceptions. It's triggered by action, not condition. Another proposed invalidating it through procedural flaws. But when they checked the digital signatures, timestamps, and contract chain logs, everything was perfect. Not a single gap. Denise, who had signed the termination notice, began to unravel, calling for a recess to review HR protocols. But that was when Jack's earlier submission surfaced. Her own email titled, "Send her off quietly." It landed like a final nail. At that moment, the board had no choice but to face it. There was no way back. Richard, steady and clear, recommended recording the payment as a special financial event and instructed the executive team to begin immediate settlement to prevent further legal fallout. I knew then the leadership at Elvira had lost control. They had resisted, deflected, denied, but truth doesn't vanish. It sits there, solid and immovable, like stone under desert sun. On the other end of the line, Jack said only one thing: it's done. Now it's just a matter of time. 3 days after the board meeting, I received an email from Jack. The subject line was simple: it's time. Inside, only one sentence: the transfer is complete. Send the receipt to accounting. I didn't laugh, didn't sigh. I just leaned back in my chair, closed my eyes for a few seconds, and let the feeling pass. It wasn't joy, it wasn't vindication, it was relief. The kind that comes when a headache that's lasted for years finally fades. They had wired $12 million, split into 3 parts: contractual compensation, the full value of my vested shares, and the dividends I would have earned next fiscal year. No message, no apology, no legal disclaimers. Just a clean transaction, as if I'd sent them an invoice for plumbing repairs. What made it complete wasn't the money. It was the unspoken admission that I hadn't been erased, that they had underestimated me, dismissed me, and now they had paid for it. I divided the sum into 3 separate accounts. One part went to a scholarship fund named after my mother, the woman who once told me that a woman doesn't have to shout to be heard. Another went into the investment portfolio I'd been building since my first year of work. And the rest I kept, as a reminder that silence can be the loudest sound in a room full of talkers. Jack, as always, didn't celebrate. He just sent another line: they won't touch anyone else for at least 3 years. I knew he was right. Inside Elvira, it became a marker in their history. According to Jack's updates, after that board meeting, the directors ordered a full restructuring of the HR and legal departments. Denise, the HR director, resigned within a week, with a short farewell email and a canceled exit meeting. Gregory, the CFO, tried to hold on but was removed from the lineup for the quarterly earnings presentation. The CEO disappeared from the media for nearly 2 weeks, returning with a meaningless post on LinkedIn about leadership and resilience. But the real storm began when the press caught scent of blood. I wasn't the one who leaked the story. But in the tech world, nothing spreads faster than a guilty conscience with a Wi-Fi signal. An internal memo slipped onto an anonymous forum. Then an internal email with the subject line, Clause 12.4b Payment Escalation, mysteriously landed in the inbox of a business reporter. 3 days later, a headline appeared in a major financial outlet. Elvara pays $12 million to silence an employee. The article didn't name me, but it didn't have to. The details were enough for everyone in the industry to know. They called me Employee X, the contract mine, the woman who cost a Fortune 500 company a quarter's profit because they didn't read the fine print. Public reaction was immediate and mostly on my side. One reader wrote, "She did what we all wish we were smart enough to do." Another said, "This is why I read every clause, even the appendices longer than a Tolstoy novel." A few former Elvara employees reached out privately. Kind messages, quiet gratitude. They thanked me for doing what they'd only ever imagined. One was Denise's old assistant, the one ordered to fire an entire team over a cold email. She said my story felt like justice by proxy. I didn't reply to most. I just read them, archived them. Because I had no desire to turn this into a viral redemption arc. What I did wasn't revenge. It was reclamation, justice by their own rules, delivered in silence. During those days when the media storm swelled, I stayed quiet. No posts, no interviews, no long essays. The only change I made was to my LinkedIn photo, a shot of me standing on a hilltop in Santa Fe, arms outstretched in the wind. The caption underneath read only one line, small clause, big consequence, and I let the world interpret it on its own. I once thought that if the day ever came when I left Galleon, I'd feel empty. But the moment the car door closed behind me, with the sunset washing gold over the Brentmore Hills, all I felt was lightness. 14 years. I had given that company the best years of my life. I stayed when others left. I walked into rooms still lit long after the floor went dark, and was always the last one to leave the meetings that ended in silence. I used to believe that if I worked hard enough, I'd be protected. But the truth was simpler. No one protects you but yourself. The settlement, 25 times my final monthly salary, arrived 1 week after the board meeting. No apology, no letter. Just a short note from legal saying, as stated under Clause 14.2b, the compensation has been processed accordingly. I didn't spend it. I didn't celebrate. I rented a small cabin on the edge of the Arizona desert. There, I woke early, brewed coffee, watered a few tufts of grass, and read the books I'd abandoned back in college because I was too busy with voluntary overtime. I learned again how to live without checking a meeting calendar before planning a weekend. I stopped measuring time and deadlines and started counting it by the light streaming through my window. Sometimes Jack, my lawyer, sent me short messages. Not about the case. There was no case. Everything had ended quietly, cleanly. He just shared updates from similar situations across the industry. Galleon won't be the first company, he wrote, but it'll be the one that remembers the longest. I didn't reply, just smiled. I'd never wanted to destroy them. I only wanted them to understand that silence doesn't mean weakness. A small clause, buried deep among hundreds of legal lines, can become a blade when the person who placed it there knows how to wait. A few old colleagues reached out. Some asked for the clause template. Others just wanted to hear the story from the beginning. But I refused. I didn't retell it. I didn't write a viral post. I didn't appear on any podcasts about corporate women and legal revenge. I just wanted peace. Because sometimes silence is the deepest form of revenge. For a few weeks, I thought about returning to the corporate world. Then I realized I no longer wanted to sit in meetings where people avoided eye contact or pour my effort into projects that ended up as round numbers on a quarterly report. I wanted to teach, maybe contract writing, maybe personal strategy, or maybe just how to live without letting others define you. One morning, sitting on the porch with a cup of hot coffee, sunlight spilling across the clay tiles, I wondered, was someone out there hearing this story, feeling the same weight, standing in the same place I once did? Maybe you're in an office somewhere, just called into a quick meeting, realizing how thin the line is between polite and cold. Maybe you're holding your breath, afraid to be labeled difficult or not a culture fit. If that's you, I understand. And I hope this story found you, quietly, the way it was meant to. I won't tell you how to fight back or claim you should do what I did. I only want you to know this. Preparation isn't about retaliation. It's about never being forced into silence when you don't want to be. You can leave, stay, fight, or walk away. But if you know why you choose and you've already weighed the cost, then no one can diminish you again. I don't know what comes next for me, but I do know this. I'll never step into any organization again without defining my boundaries from the start. And if there's one thing I can leave you with after everything I've learned, it's this: write your own clause in your contract, in your life, in your mind. A clause you're ready to activate if anyone ever forgets that you're more than a name on a payroll list. And that's how my story doesn't end in revenge, but in a beginning. For me, and maybe for you too. Are you somewhere in this story? Did a part of it make you pause because you saw yourself in it? If it did, leave a message. It doesn't have to be long, just a few words, so I know this story reached the right person. And if you want to keep hearing stories like this, where justice doesn't shout, it arrives, quiet and precise, then stay. Next time, it might be yours.